Torah, or the Pentateuch, is the central reference of the religious Judaic tradition. It has a range of meanings. It can most specifically mean the first 5 books of the 24 books of the Tanakh, and it usually includes the rabbinic commentaries. The term Torah means instruction and offers a way of life for those who follow it. It can mean the continued narrative from Genesis to the end of the Tanakh. And it can even mean the totality of Jewish teaching, culture and practice. Common to all these meanings, Torah consists of the foundational narrative of the Jews, their call into being by God, their trials and tribulations, and their covenant with their God, which involves following a way of life embodied in a set of moral and religious obligations and civil laws. In rabbinic literature, the word Torah denotes both the 5 books, Torah Shebichtav, and an oral Torah, Torah Shebi'al-Peh. The oral Torah consists of interpretations and amplifications which, according to rabbinic tradition, have been handed down from generation to generation and are now embodied in the Talmud and Midrash. According to rabbinic tradition, all of the teachings found in the Torah, both written and oral, were given by God through Moses, a prophet. According to a Midrash, the Torah was created prior to the creation of the world, and was used as the blueprint for creation. The majority of biblical scholars believe that the written books were a product of the Babylonian exilic period and that it was completed by the Persian period. However, it is worth noting that the 2004 discovery of fragments of the Hebrew Bible at Ketef Hinnom dating to the 7th century BCE, and thus to before the Babylonian captivity, suggests that at least some elements of the Torah were current before the Babylonian exile. Traditionally, the words of the Torah written on a scroll by a sofer on parchment in Hebrew. A Torah portion is read publicly at least once every 3 days, in the halakhically prescribed tune, in the presence of a congregation. Reading the Torah publicly is one of the bases for Jewish communal life. Meaning and names. The word Torah in Hebrew is derived from the root, which in the Hifi conjugation means to guide, teach. The meaning of the word is therefore teaching, doctrine, or instruction. The commonly accepted law gives a wrong impression. Other translational contexts in the English language include custom, theory, guidance, or system. The term Torah is used in the general sense to include both rabbinic Judaism's written law and oral law, serving to encompass the entire spectrum of authoritative Jewish religious teachings throughout history, including the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrash and more. And the inaccurate rendering of Torah as law may be an obstacle to understanding the ideal that is summed up in the term Talmud Torah. The earliest name for the first part of the Bible seems to have been the Torah of Moses. This title, however, is found neither in the Torah itself, nor in the works of the pre-exilic literary prophets. It appears in Joshua and Kings, but it cannot be said to refer there to the entire corpus. In contrast, there is every likelihood that its use in the post-exilic works was intended to be comprehensive. Other early titles were the Book of Moses and the Book of the Torah, which seems to be a contraction of a fuller name, the Book of the Torah of God. Alternative names. Christian scholars usually refer to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible as the Pentateuch, a term first used in the Hellenistic Judaism of Alexandria, meaning 5 books, or as the Law, or Law of Moses. Contents. The Torah starts from the beginning of God's creating the world, through the beginnings of the people of Israel, the descent into Egypt, and the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. It ends with the death of Moses, just before the people of Israel crossed to the promised land of Canaan. Interspersed in the narrative are the specific teachings given explicitly or implicitly embedded in the narrative. The Hebrew names for the books of the Torah are derived from their respective incipits. The common English names for the books are derived from the Greek Septuagint and reflect the essential theme of each book: Genesis, origin; Exodus, going out; Leviticus, relating to the Levites; Numbers, numbering of the Israelites; Deuteronomy, Second law. Genesis begins with the so-called primeval history, the story of the world's beginnings and the descent from Adam. This is followed by the story of the three patriarchs, Joseph and the four matriarchs. God gives to the patriarchs a promise of the land of Canaan. But at the end of Genesis, the sons of Jacob end up leaving Canaan for Egypt due to a regional famine. They had heard that there was a grain storage and distribution facility in Egypt. Exodus begins the story of God's revelation to his people Israel through Moses, who leads them out of Egypt to Mount Sinai. There the people accept the covenant with God, agreeing to be his people in return for agreeing to abide by his law. Moses receives the Torah from God, and teaches his laws and covenant to the people of Israel. It also talks about the first violation of the covenant where the golden calf was constructed. Exodus includes the instructions on building the tabernacle and concludes with its actual construction. Leviticus begins with instructions to the Israelites on how to use the tabernacle, which they had just built. This is followed by rules of clean and unclean, which includes the laws of slaughter and animals permissible to eat, the Day of Atonement, and various moral and ritual laws sometimes called the Holiness Code. Leviticus chapter 26 provides a detailed list of rewards for following God's commandments and a detailed list of punishments for not following them. Numbers tells how Israel consolidated itself as a community at Sinai, set out from Sinai to move towards Canaan, and spied out the land. Because of unbelief at various points, but especially at Kadesh Barnea, the Israelites were condemned to wander for 40 years in the desert in the vicinity of Kadesh instead of immediately entering the Promised Land. Even Moses sins and is told he would not live to enter the land. At the end of Numbers, Israel moves from Kadesh to the plains of Moab opposite Jericho, ready to enter the Promised Land. Deuteronomy is a series of speeches by Moses on the plains of Moab opposite Jericho, also referred to as Mishneh Torah in Hebrew. The essential gist of the entire book is a rebuke to the children of Israel to not worship idolatry, to not follow in the ways of Canaan, and to cleave to God. Moses proclaims the law, gives instruction concerning covenant renewal at Shechem, and gives Israel new laws. At the end of the book, Moses is allowed to see the Promised Land from a mountain, and then dies. The text emphasizes that no one knows where Moses was finally buried. Knowing that he was nearing the end of his life, Moses had appointed Joshua his successor, bequeathing to him the mantle of leadership. Soon afterwards, Israel begins the conquest of Canaan. Authorship: Jewish tradition as expressed in the commentary of Rashi. Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 5 states, "The Talmud holds that the Torah was written by Moses, with the exception of the last 8 verses of Deuteronomy, being written by Joshua describing his death and burial." Alternatively, Rashi quotes from the Talmud that God spoke them, and Moses wrote them with tears. The Mishnah includes the divine origin of the Torah as an essential tenet of Judaism. The modern scholarly consensus is that the Torah has multiple authors, and that its composition took place over centuries. The consensus of scholarship is that the stories are taken from 4 different written sources and that these were brought together over the course of time to form the first 5 books of the Bible as a composite work. The sources are known as J, the Jarmuth source, E, the Elohist source, P, the priestly source, and D, the Deuteronomist source. Thus, the Pentateuch comprises material taken from 6 centuries of human history, which has been put together to give a comprehensive picture of the creation of the world and of God's dealings with his peoples, specifically with the people of Israel. Torah and Judaism. Rabbinic writings offer various ideas on when the Torah was composed. The revelation to Moses at Mount Sinai is considered by most to be the revelatory event. According to dating of the text by Orthodox rabbis, this occurred in 1312 BCE. Another date given for this event is 1280 BCE. The Talmud presents 2 opinions as to when the Torah was written by Moses. One opinion holds that it was written by Moses gradually over many years as it was dictated to him, and finished close to his death. And the other opinion holds that Moses wrote the complete Torah in one writing close to his death, based on what was dictated to him over the years. The Talmud says that the last 8 verses of the Torah that discuss the death and burial of Moses could not have been written by Moses, as writing it would have been a lie, and that they were written after his death by Joshua. Abraham ibn Ezra and Joseph Bonfils observed that phrases in those verses present information that people should only have known after the time of Moses. Ibn Ezra hinted, and Bonfils explicitly stated, that Joshua wrote these verses many years after the death of Moses. Other commentators do not accept this position, and maintain that although Moses did not write those 8 verses, it was nonetheless dictated to him, and that Joshua wrote it based on instructions left by Moses, and that the Torah often describes future events, some of which have yet to occur. The Talmud states that a peculiar section in the Book of Numbers in fact forms a separate book. On this verse, a midrash on the Book of Mishleh states that these 2 verses stem from an independent book which existed, but was suppressed. Another midrash, Taame Hasarot V'Itarot, states that this section actually comes from the Book of Prophecy of Eldad and Medad. The Talmud says that God dictated 4 books of the Torah, but that Moses wrote Deuteronomy in his own words. All classical rabbinic views hold that the Torah was entirely or almost entirely Mosaic and of divine origin. Present-day Reform and liberal Jewish movements all reject Mosaic authorship, as well as most shades of conservative Judaism. Ritual use Torah reading is a Jewish religious ritual that involves the public reading of a set of passages from a Torah scroll. The term often refers to the entire ceremony of removing the Torah scroll from the ark, chanting the appropriate excerpt with special cantillation, and returning the scroll to the ark. It is distinct from academic Torah study. Regular public reading of the Torah was introduced by Ezra the scribe after the return of the Jewish people from the Babylonian captivity, as described in the Book of Nehemiah. In the modern era, adherents of Orthodox Judaism practice Torah reading according to a set procedure they believe has remained unchanged in the 2,000 years since the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem, in the 19th and 20th centuries CE. New movements such as Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism have made adaptations to the practice of Torah reading, but the basic pattern of Torah reading has usually remained the same, as a part of the morning or afternoon prayer services on certain days of the week or holidays. A section of the Pentateuch is read from a Torah scroll. On Shabbat mornings, a weekly section is read, selected so that the entire Pentateuch is read consecutively each year. On Saturday afternoons, Mondays, and Thursdays, the beginning of the following Saturday's portion is read. On Jewish holidays, the beginnings of each month, and fast days, special sections connected to the day are read. Jews observe an annual holiday, Simchat Torah, to celebrate the completion and new start of the year's cycle of readings. Torah scrolls are often dressed with a sash, a special Torah cover, various ornaments and a keter, although such customs vary among synagogues. Congregants traditionally stand when the Torah is brought out of the ark to be read, while it is being carried, and lifted, and likewise while it is returned to the ark, although they sit during the reading itself. Biblical law The Torah contains narratives, statements of law, and statements of ethics. Collectively these laws, usually called biblical law or commandments, are sometimes referred to as the Law of Moses, Mosaic Law, or Sinaitic Law. The Oral Torah. Rabbinic tradition holds that Moses learned the whole Torah while he lived on Mount Sinai for 40 days and nights, and both the oral and the written Torah were transmitted in parallel with each other, where the Torah leaves words and concepts undefined, and mentions procedures without explanation or instructions. The reader is required to seek out the missing details from supplemental sources known as the oral law or oral Torah. Some of the Torah's most prominent commandments needing further explanation are Tefillin, as indicated in Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 8 among other places. Tefillin are to be placed on the arm and on the head between the eyes. However, there are no details provided regarding what tefillin are or how they are to be constructed. Kashrut, as indicated in Exodus chapter 23 verse 19 among other places, a young goat may not be boiled in its mother's milk. In addition to numerous other problems with understanding the ambiguous nature of this law, there are no vowelization characters in the Torah. They are provided by the oral tradition. This is particularly relevant to this law, as the Hebrew word for milk is identical to the word for animal fat when vowels are absent. Without the oral tradition, it is not known whether the violation is in mixing meat with milk or with fat. Shabbat laws. With the severity of Sabbath violation, namely the death penalty, one would assume that direction would be provided as to how exactly such a serious and core commandment should be upheld. However, most information regarding the rules and traditions of Shabbat are dictated in the Talmud and other books deriving from Jewish oral law. According to classical rabbinic texts, this parallel set of material was originally transmitted to Moses at Sinai, and then from Moses to Israel. At that time, it was forbidden to write and publish the oral law, as any writing would be incomplete and subject to misinterpretation and abuse. However, after exile, dispersion and persecution, this tradition was lifted when it became apparent that in writing was the only way to ensure that the oral law could be preserved. After many years of effort by a great number of Tannaim, the oral tradition was written down around 200 CE by Rabbi Judah HaNasi, who took up the compilation of a nominally written version of the oral law, the Mishnah. Other oral traditions from the same time period not entered into the Mishnah were recorded as Baraitot, and the Tosefta. Other traditions were written down as Midrashim. After continued persecution, more of the oral law was committed to writing. A great many more lessons, lectures and traditions only alluded to in the few hundred pages of Mishnah, became the thousands of pages now called the Gemara. Gemara is written in Aramaic, having been compiled in Babylon. The Mishnah and Gemara together are called the Talmud. The rabbis in Israel also collected their traditions and compiled them into the Jerusalem Talmud. Since the greater number of rabbis lived in Babylon, the Babylonian Talmud has precedence, should the two be in conflict. Orthodox and conservative branches of Judaism accept these texts as the basis for all subsequent halakha and codes of Jewish law, which are held to be normative. Reform and Reconstructionist Judaism deny that these texts, or the Torah itself for that matter, may be used for determining normative law, but accept them as the authentic and only Jewish version for understanding the Torah and its development. Throughout history, humanistic Judaism holds that the Torah is a historical, political, and sociological text, but does not believe that every word of the Torah is true, or even morally correct. Humanistic Judaism is willing to question the Torah and to disagree with it, believing that the entire Jewish experience, not just the Torah, should be the source for Jewish behavior and ethics. Divine significance of letters, Jewish mysticism. Kabbalists hold that not only do the words of Torah give a divine message, but they also indicate a far greater message that extends beyond them. Thus they hold that even as small a mark as a kotzo shel yot, the serif of the Hebrew letter yot, the smallest letter, or decorative markings, or repeated words, were put there by God to teach scores of lessons. This is regardless of whether that yod appears in the phrase, I am the Lord thy God, or whether it appears in, and God spoke unto Moses saying. In a similar vein, Rabbi Akiva is said to have learned a new law from every A in the Torah. The word A is meaningless by itself, and serves only to mark the direct object. In other words, the Orthodox belief is that even apparently contextual text, and God spoke unto Moses saying, is no less important than the actual statement. One Kabbalistic interpretation is that the Torah constitutes one long name of God, and that it was broken up into words so that human minds can understand it. While this is effective since it accords with our human reason, it is not the only way that the text can be broken up.